There is a park at the northern tip of Halifax, Nova Scotia, where people walk their dogs and sit by the water on summer afternoons. It has a clean path, a view of the Bedford Basin, and a small replica church that doubled as a museum. On any given weekday, you could walk the whole thing in 10 minutes and leave thinking it was just another pleasant piece of green space in a Canadian city. But if you know what stood there before the park and what was done to make room for it, the walk feels completely different. The place is called Africville, and what happened there is one of the most documented, most deliberate, and least talked about acts of institutional racism in Canadian history. The story starts long before the demolitions of the 1960s, and black people had been living on the southern shore of Bedford Basin since at least the early 1800s. Many were descendants of formerly enslaved people who arrived in Nova Scotia after the American Revolution and the War of 1812, promised freedom and land by the British in exchange for fighting on their side. What they got was whatever land the white settlement did not want. The area north of Halifax, on a rocky, windswept strip of shore, was considered marginal at best. So that is where black families settled, built homes, fished the basin, farmed what the land allowed, and over the following century, turned a hardscrabble plot into something real. By the 1840s, the community had a name. By 1849, it had the Seaview African United Baptist Church, which immediately became the social and spiritual center of everything. The church was where Sunday services happened, but also where community meetings were held, where births and deaths were recorded, where people gathered when something went wrong. Former residents consistently describe it the same way, as the beating heart of Africville. Around it grew stores, a school, a post office, small businesses. About 400 people across 80 families called it home by the mid-20th century. It was tight-knit in the way that only communities built out of shared necessity ever are. Irvine Carvery, a former resident, put it plainly. "You were never isolated in Africville," he said. "The doors were always open." That stayed with him his whole life. And while all of that was being built, the city of Halifax was doing something else entirely. Since the earliest years of the community, the city had been collecting taxes in Africville. It took the money the same way it took taxes from every other Halifax neighborhood. But it did not send back what every other Halifax neighborhood received. No paved roads, no running water, no sewage system, no garbage collection, no streetlights, no public transit, no adequate police protection. For well over a century, while the residents of Africville paid into the city just like everyone else, Halifax looked the other way. And it did more than look away. Starting in the second half of the 19th century, the city of Halifax made a decision, repeatedly and deliberately, to place its most unwanted facilities next to Africville. Not near other neighborhoods, next to Africville specifically. A fertilizer plant, slaughterhouses. Rockhead Prison opened in 1854. Human waste disposal pits. The Infectious Diseases Hospital in the 1870s. 3 separate systems of railway tracks, the first of which was cut directly through the village in 1854, expropriated several homes in the process, and left residents with no compensation and speeding trains running through their backyards. By 1915, Halifax City Council had formally declared in writing that Africville will always be an industrial district. Not a neighborhood, an industrial district. The city had decided what Africville was for, and it was not for the people living in it. Then in 1955, the city moved its garbage dump to the edge of the community, 350 meters from the nearest homes. Council had considered several other locations for that dump. According to the record, they rejected those other locations specifically because residents in those areas would find it unacceptable. The people of Africville were apparently a different calculation. The wells the community relied on for drinking water sat directly in the contamination path. 3 years after the dump arrived, in 1958, Halifax officially classified Africville as a slum. Think about that sequence. The city spent a century denying the community basic services that every tax-paying white neighborhood in Halifax had. Then it spent another several decades putting its worst facilities on the doorstep of that community. Then, once the community was visibly degraded by everything the city had done to it, Halifax called it a slum and used that label as the justification for tearing it down. In 1962, a regional council voted to adopt a recommendation to remove what it called blighted housing and dilapidated structures in the Africville area. At a public meeting that same year, 100 Africville residents voted against relocation. They asked for what they had been asking for all along, not removal, but services, running water, a sewage system, the same basic infrastructure every other Halifax neighborhood already had. Resident Joe Skinner told CBC cameras at the time exactly what he thought. "When you own land in this country," he said, "you are not a second-class citizen. But when your land is taken from you and you are offered nothing, then you become a peasant in any man's country." Halifax Council voted to proceed anyway. The relocation began in July 1964, when the city purchased the first Africville properties. Residents who could prove they owned their land were offered market value, though market value for land that had been deliberately degraded by a century of city neglect was not generous. Residents who could not produce deeds, which was many of them because their families had lived there for generations without formal paperwork, were offered a flat fee of $500 for a home that had been in the family for decades. Those who refused to leave were told the city could seize their property by expropriation. Some families had their belongings moved in Halifax City dump trucks, not moving vans, dump trucks. The choice of vehicle was not logistical. It was a statement about how the city regarded the people being relocated and the possessions they had accumulated over lifetimes. The city demolished each house as soon as its residents moved out. Occasionally, according to documented accounts, a house was bulldozed when the opportunity arose, such as when a resident was in the hospital. The city did not wait for them to come home. The Seaview Baptist Church came down on November 20th, 1967, in the middle of the night. The city wanted to avoid controversy, so it chose darkness. Official documents were later found to show the church had been sold in 1968, but the page in question had been edited by hand to make the transaction appear 1 year earlier, apparently to match the 1967 demolition after the fact. The church came down with the vital records of many Africville residents still inside: birth records, marriage records, death records, and documentation that could have established land ownership claims for future compensation. All of it went with the building. By January 2nd, 1970, the last resident, Aaron Carvery, had gone. Approximately 400 people from 80 families had been scattered across Halifax and beyond. The land was cleared and converted into a park. The bridge the city had been planning, the A. Murray McKay Bridge, went up nearby. The port facilities at Fairview Cove expanded to the west. Halifax got what it had always seemed to want from that strip of waterfront. What followed was 5 decades of people refusing to let the story be forgotten. Former residents held reunions on the site of their demolished homes, which continued for years, and in many cases still happen today. In 1983, the Africville Genealogy Society was formed specifically to pursue recognition and compensation. The campaign ran for over a decade before producing any result. In 1996, the Canadian government designated Africville a National Historic Site of Canada, recognizing it as representative of Black settlement in Nova Scotia and as, in their own words, an enduring symbol of the need for vigilance in defense of Black Canadian institutions. A class action lawsuit was filed against the city of Halifax in March 1996. It took 14 more years to reach any resolution. In February 2010, Halifax City Council ratified what it called the Africville Apology. The mayor issued a public statement acknowledging the destruction of the community and what the city had done. The settlement included $3 million in funding to rebuild the Seaview Baptist Church and provide other community support. A 2.5-acre parcel of land near the original site was transferred. The rebuilt church opened in 2011 as the Africville Museum. Some former residents accepted the settlement. Others did not think it came close to addressing what had happened. Descendants filed a class action lawsuit in 2016 seeking reparations. That case was thrown out. The debate about whether the 2010 apology was adequate and what more the city owes the community has continued through the most recent Halifax planning process, which as of 2024 was still inviting community input on the long-term future of the Africville site. Africville is not an obscure story in Halifax. Local historians, Dalhousie University researchers, and Canadian Museum of Human Rights exhibitions have documented it in detail. The National Film Board produced a documentary about it in 1991. Canadian author Ingrid Waldron used it as the central case study in her book on environmental racism in Indigenous and Black communities, which later became the basis for a Netflix documentary. Canada Post issued a commemorative stamp. The church has been rebuilt. The mayor apologized. And yet most Canadians, outside of Nova Scotia, and particularly outside of the Black Canadian community, have never heard of it. That gap matters because the machinery that destroyed Africville was not an accident or a one-time failure of judgment. It was a sustained, multi-generational system of decisions that took well over 100 years to play out. Deny services to an area while collecting taxes from it. I placed the city's most toxic and unwanted facilities there because the residents are not in a position to refuse. Declare the resulting conditions a slum. Use the slum designation to justify demolition. Remove the people in dump trucks. Bulldoze the church at night. Forge the paperwork. None of that happened quickly. None of it happened by accident. Every step had a vote, a meeting, a signature, a decision made by people who understood what they were doing and did it anyway. The park on the Bedford Basin is pleasant. The museum inside the rebuilt church is worth visiting. But the ground underneath that park has a history that a landscaping project and a $3 million settlement do not resolve. Africville existed for over 120 years. The people who lived there built something real out of land nobody else wanted, against conditions that would have ended most communities long before. The city that taxed them, ignored them, poisoned them, and finally bulldozed them did so in broad daylight over the course of a century and called it urban renewal. What you call it depends on what you think actually happened, but the facts are not in dispute.